The dog hit the steel exam table like dead weight. No warning. No call ahead. Just 3 men shoving through the clinic's glass door at 2:47 in the morning. Soaking wet, carrying a limp black shepherd wrapped in a bloody jacket. Selim Adissa didn't ask questions. He was already pulling on gloves before the first man's mouth opened. He got hit. We don't know how bad. The voice was low, controlled, the kind of calm that only comes from a man who has seen much worse and survived it. Selim pressed 2 fingers against the dog's ribcage. Faint pulse, labored breathing, left rear leg twisted at a wrong angle. Possible internal bleeding. He moved fast, flipping on the overhead light, calling back to the supply shelf without looking, muscle memory doing the work while his brain ran the checklist. 3 men stood back against the wall. They didn't hover. They didn't panic. That was the first thing Selim noticed. Most people fall apart when their animal is dying. They grab your arm. They ask the same question 4 times. They cry before there's even a reason to cry. These 3 just stood there, watching, giving him room, like they understood that the best thing they could do right now was stay out of the way. Selim had been the only one on the night shift for 6 hours. His supervisor went home sick. The front desk volunteer left at midnight. It was just him, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the rain hammering the roof. Now this. He cut open the jacket around the dog's torso and stopped. The smell hit him first. Not blood, not wet fur, something else. Something that moved through the air and settled at the back of his throat like warm cedar and dark rain, and something he had no clean word for. His hands kept working. His mind registered the smell and filed it away under things to think about later. You the owner? Selim didn't look up. Yes. One answer. 3 men. Selim glanced up for just a second. They were identical. Not similar. Not close. Identical, same jaw, same height, same stillness. 3 versions of the same man, standing shoulder to shoulder in his small clinic at 3 in the morning, wearing dark clothing with rain still dripping off the edges of their sleeves. His hands did not stop moving. I need you to stay back. All of you. This is going to take time and I need space. The one closest to the table, slight difference, faint scar through his left brow, gave a short nod. No argument. He stepped back half a step and motioned to the others with 2 fingers. They all moved. That was the second thing Selim noticed. 1 word from one of them and all 3 adjusted without a sound. He didn't have time to think about what that meant. The shepherd's oxygen levels were dropping. Selim worked for the next 40 minutes with the focused silence of someone who did not allow themselves the luxury of fear during a crisis. He was 26 years old and had been working emergency veterinary shifts since he was 22. He knew how to separate feeling from function. He knew how to move through panic without showing it. But the smell in that room was doing something to him. Every few minutes it rolled through the air again. Warm, dense, layered. His omega biology registered it before his brain did. A low hum behind his sternum that he pressed down hard every time it rose. Not now. Not here. He sutured the internal tear. He stabilized the leg. He pushed fluids and monitored breathing and adjusted the 4-line twice. By the time the dog's vitals leveled out, Selim's back ached and his hands had a faint tremor from the concentration. He stripped off the top pair of gloves and exhaled slow. He's stable. The shift in the room was immediate. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a collective release of held breath from 3 men who had been perfectly still for 40 straight minutes. The one with the scar pressed a hand flat against the wall like he needed a second. Selim turned to face them properly for the first time. Up close, they were larger than he'd clocked from across the room. Not just tall. Built in that dense, heavy way that said the size was functional, not decorative. Their clothing was expensive but plain. No logos. No flash. The kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. He was about to ask for their contact information. The shortest one, still easily 6'2", stepped forward 1 pace and looked at Selim with dark eyes that held something unreadable. You just saved something more valuable than you realize, he said. quiet, certain, like a statement of fact rather than a compliment. Before Selim could respond, before he could ask what that meant or what dog could possibly carry that kind of weight behind a sentence like that, his phone buzzed on the counter. He looked down for 2 seconds. Supply alert. He turned back. The man was already stepping away. Selim stared at the three of them in the low light of the clinic hallway. Rain still loud against the windows, the shepherd breathing slow and even on the table behind him. And none of them explained. Not one word about what had just been said. Who was this dog to them? And what had Selim just walked into the middle of? Hi viewers. Have you ever done something for a complete stranger in the middle of the night and felt like it changed something in you? Drop your story in the comments. I want to read them. The coffee was bad. Selim knew it before he poured it. The pot had been sitting since 11, thick and bitter and way past the point of being drinkable. He poured it anyway, for cups because his hands needed something to do and because 3 large men standing in a hallway with nowhere to go looked like a problem that needed at least the gesture of hospitality. He handed them out without ceremony. The one with the scar took his and looked at it. Looked at Selim. Drank it without a word. That almost made Selim smile. They sat in the narrow hallway outside the recovery area. 3 of them along one wall on the low bench, Selim on the floor with his back against the opposite wall because the bench wasn't made for 4 people and he wasn't about to ask one of them to move. The shepherd was sedated and monitored. The rain had dropped from a roar to a low tap against the windows. For a long time no one said anything. Selim didn't push it. He was tired. His shift had technically ended an hour ago. His second job started in 5 hours, inventory at a warehouse 2 bus rides east. He should have been horizontal 30 minutes ago, but the dog needed watching, and the 3 men weren't leaving. How long have you worked nights? The voice came from the left end of the bench. The one Selim mentally tagged as the quietest. He hadn't spoken once during the surgery. Sharp eyes, jaw set like a closed door. Since I was 22. Selim wrapped both hands around his cup. Night shifts pay 30% more. You do this alone? Most nights. A beat of silence. That doesn't bother you? Selim thought about that honestly. It did the first year. Now it's just the job. The man in the middle leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He had a different energy from the other 2. Not warmer exactly, but more open. Like he'd made a decision somewhere in the last hour to stop being guarded. Zoran, he said and extended a hand. Selim shook it. Selim, my brothers. A slight tilt of the head left and right. Zail, Zev. 3 names. 1 syllable each. Selim stored them. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of talking that people do when they're trying to impress each other. It was the kind that happens between very tired people in a quiet building at 4 in the morning. Slow, a little unguarded, real. Selim learned the dog's name was Onyx, that they'd had him for 6 years, that he'd been hit crossing a private road on their property during the storm. They learned Selim had 2 jobs, that he'd been in veterinary emergency medicine for 4 years, that he lived 20 minutes from the clinic by bus and 40 minutes by foot, and that he walked when he missed the last route because cabs ate into the budget. Zev, the quiet one, said nothing for most of it, but he was listening. Selim could feel it. At some point the rain outside went completely still, the kind of stillness that feels earned, like the sky finally ran out of things to say. Selim rolled his neck and heard it crack twice, and then Zev moved, not dramatically. He didn't reach across. He just shifted forward slightly, and his hand came to rest near Selim's wrist on the floor between them, and then 2 of his fingers pressed lightly, briefly, against the inside of Selim's wrist. Not a grab, not a hold. Contact, deliberate and quiet. 1 second, maybe 2. Selim's whole body went still. Something moved through him from that point of contact and up. Not heat exactly, more like pressure. Like a door opening inside a room that had been sealed for a long time. His omega biology, the part he spent considerable energy keeping quiet and managed and professional, responded before he could catch it. He pulled his wrist back slowly. casually, like it hadn't just rattled something loose in his chest. He didn't look at Zev. He looked at his coffee cup. Zoran was saying something about the shepherd's recovery timeline. Selim answered. His voice came out even. Normal. He was good at normal. The sky outside the high narrow windows started going gray. Not sunrise yet, just the slow drain from black to the color of old ash. Selim stood, checked on Onyx one last time, noted vitals, adjusted the saline flow. When he came back to the hallway, it was empty. The bench was bare. He walked to the front of the clinic. The glass door was closed. The parking lot outside held nothing but puddles and the last of the dark. He walked to the reception counter and found 4 things. 3 empty coffee cups stacked neatly, and 1 matte black credit card sitting flat in the center of the counter. No name on it. No note. Just the card and the silence and the faint ghost of cedar and rain still sitting in the air of the hallway. Selim picked up the card and turned it over. Nothing on the back either. He stood there for a moment in the gray pre-dawn light of an empty clinic, holding a card that belonged to no one identifiable, left by 3 men who had appeared from a rainy night and then walked back into it without explanation. The dog was in his care now, and he had no way of reaching the men who owned it. Who were they? And what exactly had they just left behind? The nausea hit on a Tuesday. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a wave, low, rolling, manageable. That came in around the 3rd hour of Selim's morning shift. He set down the chart he was holding, breathed through his nose, and waited for it to pass. Passed. He went back to work. Came back Wednesday. Stronger. Then Thursday. Then it wasn't just nausea anymore. It was fatigue that sleep didn't fix. It was food smells hitting wrong. It was his body doing things that didn't match any flu he'd ever had. Selim was not someone who panicked. He was also not someone who ignored data. He made the appointment on a Friday and sat in a clinic waiting room the following Monday with a paper cup of water he wasn't drinking, running through the list of rational explanations. Stress, overwork, sleep deficit, vitamin deficiency. All of those things were true about his life, and any one of them could cause what he was feeling. He kept the other possibility in a locked room in the back of his mind. The nurse called his name. He went in. 20 minutes and several questions later, the doctor ordered a blood panel and a secondary test that made the locked room in Selim's mind start rattling its door. He sat on the paper-covered exam table and looked at the wall. There was a poster about hand washing. He read it 3 times. The doctor came back in with the results faster than Selim expected, which was never a good sign. She was a small woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and an expression that was carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that trained medical professionals use when they need a moment to figure out how to begin. She sat down across from him. Selim. A pause. The test is positive. The locked room door blew open. He heard the word. He knew the word. He had counseled pet owners through unexpected news enough times to know that there is always a moment between hearing something and actually taking it in, a half-second gap where your mind is still running its previous program. Then it landed. He pressed both hands flat on the top of his thighs and said nothing. You're approximately 6 weeks along, the doctor said. Given your designation, I want to refer you to a specialist. Male omega pregnancies carry a specific set of I know the complications. His voice came out steady. He was grateful for that. I work in medicine. She nodded. She gave him space. He sat with it. 6 weeks back. The rainy night. The clinic. The coffee that tasted like burned rubber. 3 men sitting in a hallway. The quiet that fell over all of them like something shared. The warmth that shouldn't have been there. He had told himself it wasn't what it felt like. He had convinced himself for 6 weeks that nothing had really happened, that the chemistry had been one-sided, biological noise, the body reacting to high-concentration alpha pheromones the way it sometimes did without consent or reason or consequence. He had been wrong. The doctor was still talking. Something about the genetic panel, about the blood markers, about the way male omega pregnancies required additional screening due to the rare nature of the chromosomal She stopped mid-sentence. Selim looked up. She was looking at the screen with an expression that wasn't neutral anymore. It was something closer to confused. She pushed her glasses down from the top of her head and leaned toward the monitor. She looked at the results, looked at Selim, looked back at the screen. The silence in the room stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. She finally turned to face him fully, and her voice dropped to something careful and measured when she said it. This baby carries 3 alpha genetic signatures. Selim did not move. The hand-washing poster was still on the wall. He read it a 4th time. He told no one. That was the decision Selim made in the parking lot of the medical clinic, sitting on a bench with his paper cup of water and the afternoon sun pressing down on the back of his neck. He sat there for 22 minutes. He did the math, not emotional math, practical math. What he had, what he made, what this was going to cost in time, in money, in exposure. Then he stood up, took the bus back across town, and picked up his evening shift. The weeks that followed had a specific shape. He bought 2 sizes up in hoodies. Dark-colored, loose through the middle, the kind that read as just a man who runs cold rather than a man with anything to hide. He was good at dressing for invisibility, had been for years, long before this. The clinic's break room ran warm. He used that as cover for the weeks he needed it. He picked up extra shifts where he could. Covered for Marcus on weekends. Took the overflow calls from the after-hours line when Dina had her procedure and needed 2 weeks of light duty. He told himself it was helping out. It was also building the account. Because male omega pregnancies did not come cheap. The specialist appointments alone ran 3 times the cost of standard prenatal care. The supplemental hormones, the additional scans, the dietary adjustments, the fact that his current insurance plan had a cap on omega-specific coverage that he'd never had a reason to pay close attention to before. He paid close attention now. The fatigue hit hardest in week 10. There were 3 nights that month where Selim sat on the edge of his bed after a double shift and genuinely could not remember taking off his shoes. And yet there they were, neatly placed at the foot of the bed, which meant he'd done it on autopilot and his body had simply decided not to log the memory. He ate. He slept when he could. He kept the apartment at 68 degrees because cold helped with the nausea and the landlord had stopped charging extra for the electric after Selim fixed the unit's thermostat issue himself and saved the man a $400 repair call. Small things. He had always survived on small things adding up. But the fear was there too. Not always loud. Not always in his face. Mostly it came at night. When the clinic was quiet and the only sound was the monitors and the soft breathing of sedated animals and his own mind moving through the same question it kept circling back to like a tongue against a sore tooth. Who were the Voron triplets? He had the name from the credit card. Not from the card itself. It held no name. But from the bank line that showed on his clinic system when the auto charge for Onyx's emergency care had processed 2 days after that night. A holding account. Corporate structure. Voron Holdings LLC. He typed the name into a search on his phone during a slow overnight. He wished he hadn't. The results came back fast and thick and wide. Not a business page. Not a local enterprise. International coverage. Financial press, crime reports, 3 separate investigative pieces from outlets Selim recognized. 2 that he didn't but whose sourcing looked solid. The Voron name sat at the intersection of legitimate empire and the kind of enterprise that didn't appear in press releases. Real estate, private security contracts, shipping, and underneath it all, the kind of language that journalists used when they couldn't directly say what they meant but needed to say it anyway. Selim read until his hands went cold. Then he set his phone face down on the counter and checked on his patients. He went home at 6 a.m., changed, lay down. Stared at the ceiling. His hand moved to the small, still flat curve of his lower abdomen. The specialist had said the baby's development was on track. Healthy. Strong markers. Nothing to flag clinically. 3 alpha signatures. 3 men who moved like they owned whatever room they walked into. 3 men who had sat in his hallway and drunk terrible coffee and left behind a black card and no explanation. Three men who were apparently connected to more power and more danger than Selim had any business being near. His child's fathers. He pressed his palm flat and let himself feel it. Not the fear, which was always there, but the other thing underneath it. The thing that was quieter and more stubborn and refused to be reasoned out of him no matter how many news articles he read. "I don't know who your fathers really are," he said to the ceiling, to the small life barely making itself known yet beneath his hand. His voice was low, even, certain. "But I'll protect you." He meant it in every way a person can mean a thing. And somewhere across the city, in a world Selim hadn't been meant to touch, the men who didn't know he existed were about to start asking questions they couldn't stop asking. The shepherd was fully recovered. Onyx moved through the east corridor of the Voron estate like he owned the floor, which, by the logic of the house, he mostly did. 6 years of being in that space had given him an authority over the geography that the staff respected and the security team had simply stopped fighting. He went where he wanted. He slept where the morning light landed. He answered to his name when it suited him. Zoran watched the dog pace the length of the corridor and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. "He walks clean," Zale said from the doorway, arms crossed, watching the same thing. "No limp." Zoran nodded. "Good." The veterinarian had done thorough work. More than thorough. The internal repair had been precise. Zoran had sent the records to their private medical consultant the following day, and the response had come back with a single line. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. He thought about that. About the clinic. About the single figure who had been there alone in the middle of the night, already moving before the door was fully open. "You're thinking about him again." Zale hadn't moved from the doorway. Zoran said nothing. "You've been doing it since we got back." Zale pushed off the frame and came into the corridor. "Both of you." From the far end of the hall, Zev looked up from the chair he'd been reading in for the last hour without turning a page. That was answer enough. They didn't talk about it directly at first. That wasn't how the three of them operated. They processed in parallel, each one turning the same information over alone until the edges were worn enough to discuss. It had been that way their entire lives. Three men who shared genetics and history and, in moments they didn't examine too closely, something else. A current between them that had no clean name. It had activated in that clinic. All three of them knew it. "He works 2 jobs, Zoran said finally. Not to start an argument. Just to say it out loud to people who already knew. "And covers night shifts alone," Zev said from down the hall. "Medical expense level suggests no secondary support." Zale's voice was flat the way it got when he was masking an emotional register he didn't want visible. No family listed in the area. They had not gone looking for that information casually. Zoran wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "We left too fast." The words sat in the corridor. None of them disputed them. They had made the call that morning as the sky went gray. The decision hadn't been careless. There were people who watched the Voron family's movements as a professional occupation. People who cataloged associations, tracked new contacts, looked for pressure points. A young Omega working alone in an emergency clinic on the south side of Tacoma, who had spent 6 hours in close proximity to all three of them, was exactly the kind of thing those people would notice. Distance was protection. They had given him distance. But that was the version of the logic Zoran rehearsed when he was being professional about it. The other version, the one he didn't rehearse, was simpler and more uncomfortable. He hadn't stopped thinking about Selim Adissa since they walked out that door. Neither had his brothers. "Zale." Zoran looked at him. Zale didn't look away. "I know. It's not. I know what it is." A pause. "Same thing I felt. Same thing Zev felt." He glanced down the hall. Zev had put the book down. "We're not going to pretend that 6 hours in a hallway didn't do what it did just because it was inconvenient." Zev stood up. He moved down the corridor at his usual pace. Unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man who had learned a long time ago that speed didn't actually solve most things. He stopped between his brothers. "I've been thinking about him," he said. "No hedging. No qualifier. Zoran exhaled. The estate's security system ran a continuous feed across 32 cameras. Interior, exterior, the main gate, the road approach, and 2 cameras that had been installed in the rear corridor of the Tacoma Veterinary Emergency Clinic 6 weeks before that night. Positioned there because a low-level associate had flagged the clinic as a potential surveillance blind spot near one of their transit routes, and the Voron standard was to see before being seen. Zoran hadn't pulled that footage in weeks. He pulled it now. He didn't need to watch much of it. The timestamp was 6:14 a.m. The rear parking lot. Gray dawn light. Selim Adissa, in the same clothes he'd worn through the night, standing beside the back entrance with his bag on one shoulder. He was looking at something in his hand, too small to read clearly on the feed. He stood there for a moment. Then he put the item in his pocket, adjusted his bag, and walked toward the bus stop at the far end of the lot. The way he walked was careful, not rushed, not defeated, just precise. Like a man who knew exactly how much energy he had and was not going to waste a single step of it. Zoran watched until the figure disappeared off the edge of the frame. The instinct that moved through him was not subtle, and it was not logical, and it did not care that he had reasons for every decision he'd made that morning 6 weeks ago. He turned to his brothers. Both of them had been watching the same screen. Neither of them was looking at the footage anymore. They were looking at him. Our instincts recognized him that night, Zev said. Quiet, direct. The way he said all the things that mattered. No one argued, because they all already knew it was true. The question wasn't what they had felt. The question was what Selim Adissa had been holding in his hand at 6:14 in the morning, and why the look on his face, even in low-resolution gray dawn footage, looked like a man carrying something he hadn't been meant to carry alone. The first contraction came at 11:48 p.m. on a Wednesday. Selim was standing at the kitchen counter, eating crackers over the sink because the couch felt too far away and sitting down and getting back up had become a whole production. He felt the tightening move across the lower half of his body like a hand slowly closing into a fist, and then releasing. He set the crackers down, counted, waited. The second one came 14 minutes later. He called the after-hours specialist line with one hand and started pulling his go bag out of the hall closet with the other. He'd had it packed since week 32. Insurance paperwork. A change of clothes. The small list of medical specifications the specialist had typed up for him. Because a male omega presenting in labor at a standard hospital emergency room required documentation that most front desk staff had never seen before, and Selim had long since accepted that he was going to have to be his own advocate through every step of this. He always had been. The line picked up. He gave his name, his designation, his gestational week, his contraction timing. The voice on the other end told him to come in. He called the cab. Not the app. The direct number for the company 2 blocks over whose dispatcher knew his address because he used them for post-overnight shift rides when the buses stopped running. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. 12 minutes, she said. Thank you, Dorinda. He sat on the edge of his bed and breathed. 9 months. 9 months of doing this alone in this apartment, in this neighborhood, on this budget, with this secret sitting in the middle of his life like a weight he'd learned to carry so well he sometimes forgot it was there. Until moments like this one, when the weight made itself known in a way that could not be managed or scheduled or deferred. The cab came in 10 minutes. The hospital was 22 minutes away in light traffic. The driver, a quiet man named Terrell who had once waited 15 minutes without complaint while Selim went back inside for his forgotten transit card, did not ask questions. He drove. He kept the music low. He pulled up to the emergency entrance and said, "You good?" before Selim got out. "Working on it," Selim said. He meant it both ways. The triage nurse at the ER desk looked at the documentation Selim slid across before she'd finished her first sentence, which saved them both time. She paged the on-call OB specialist, flagged the designation intake code, and had him in an assessment room within 8 minutes. The contractions were picking up pace. Still manageable. Still space between them. But the space was shrinking. The assessment room had that specific hospital smell. Antiseptic and recycled air and something underneath it that was neither clean nor dirty, just institutional. And Selim lay back against the inclined bed and stared at the ceiling tiles and counted the grid squares the way he'd trained himself to slow his breathing down in high-pressure situations. He was alone in the room. The nurse had gone to get the specialist. The monitor beside him tracked 2 heartbeats. His and the baby's. Both steady. Both present. He pressed one hand flat against his side. Almost, he said quietly. Not to the room. Not to himself exactly. A door somewhere down the hall opened and closed. And then, through the gap under his assessment room door, carried on the recycled hospital air like something that didn't belong in this building, in this context, at this hour. Cedar. Rain. And something deeper underneath it that his body recognized before his brain caught up. He went very still. His hands stayed pressed against his side. The smell wasn't one of them. It was all 3. Somewhere in this hospital, close and getting closer. The Voron triplets were here. His heart rate on the monitor ticked upward. Not from fear. From something more complicated than fear. The footsteps in the corridor were slow. Deliberate. Not the quick, efficient pace of staff. The kind of steps that belonged to men who moved like they had already decided where they were going and nothing in the building was going to change that. They stopped. Right outside his door. Selim watched the handle. Turned. The door opened and all 3 of them stepped inside. Zoran first. Then Zale. Then Zev, who pulled the door closed behind him with a quiet, final click that made the room feel smaller immediately. They stopped when they saw him. Not the room. Him. The hospital bed. The monitors. The unmistakable round shape beneath the thin blanket that no amount of overhead lighting or clinical distance could make ambiguous. 9 months of evidence, right there, in a room none of them had been supposed to find. Zoran's face did something complicated that he didn't finish processing in front of anyone. Zale stood absolutely still. The kind of still that meant he was containing something very large behind a very thin wall. Zev just looked at Selim. Directly. Without flinching. For a moment. Maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10, it was hard to measure. Nobody said a single word. The monitors kept tracking. 2 heartbeats. Steady. Selim was the one who broke the silence. How did you find me? His voice came out level. Not hostile. Not afraid. The voice of a man who had spent 9 months preparing for a version of this conversation and still wasn't sure any preparation was going to be enough. Hospital system flagged a male Omega high-risk labor admit. Zale's voice was tight. We have a contact. You monitor hospital admissions. We monitor a lot of things. He paused. We weren't monitoring you specifically. That's meant to make me feel better? Zale said nothing. Zoran moved first. Not toward Selim, just away from the door. One slow step that brought him to the side of the room like a man trying to take up less space than his size allowed. He looked at the monitors. Looked at the numbers. Looked at the second heartbeat tracing its line across the screen. How long? He said. Not a question exactly. More like a man trying to orient himself to information that was rearranging everything. 9 months. Selim held his gaze. Since the night you brought in the dog. The silence that followed was a specific kind. The kind that fills up with things people aren't saying yet because they haven't decided which truth to start with. A contraction came. It was stronger than the last one. Selim's jaw tightened. He breathed through it. 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. And kept his eyes on the ceiling for the 12 seconds it lasted. When it released, he lowered his gaze and found all 3 of them watching him with expressions that had cracked open somewhere in those 12 seconds. Zoran had taken another step forward without seeming to notice he'd done it. Zev was at the foot of the bed. You went through all of this alone, Zev said. Yes. 9 months. That's what I said. Zev didn't look away. That wasn't a question. That was me understanding what I'm looking at. The door behind them opened. The OB specialist, Dr. McKenna Osei, coming in brisk and efficient with a tablet and a tone that said she'd seen unexpected things in labor rooms before and was not going to slow down for this one. She assessed the room in a single sweep, clocked the 3 large men and their collective effect, and moved past it entirely. Selim, contractions are at 7 minutes. She looked at the monitors. We're going to do a cervical assessment. Are these? A brief glance at the three men. Staying? Selim looked at them. He hadn't decided yet, but Zev answered before he could. We're staying. No request in it. No aggression. Just the quiet certainty of a man who was not going to be on the other side of that door. Dr. Osei looked at Selim. He thought about 9 months of a closed door and a packed bag and a conversation with a ceiling. He thought about the thing his body had recognized in the hallway smell 20 minutes ago before his brain had caught up. He thought about the word alone and how tired he was of being the only definition of it he'd ever known. They stay, he said. Dr. Osei nodded and moved on. She ran the assessment. She adjusted the monitoring. She spoke to the nurse in shorthand while Selim absorbed the presence of three men standing in a semicircle at the edge of his space. Not crowding, not demanding, just there. Then the doctor looked up from her tablet. Her expression shifted. Selim. She kept her voice clinical, professional, but there was something underneath it. I need to flag something in the genetic scan we ran on intake. A pause. Measured. Careful. This baby carries 3 distinct alpha markers. The room went completely quiet. 3 sets of eyes moved from the doctor to Selim to each other. Zoran's mouth opened, closed, opened again. 3, he said. 3 confirmed alpha signatures, Dr. Osei said. It's extremely rare. I've only seen documentation of it twice in my career. Zale made a sound that wasn't a word. Low. Something like the noise a man makes when the floor shifts under him and he's deciding whether to reach for something or just let himself fall. The next contraction hit before anyone could speak again. Longer this time, harder, rolling through Selim's body with an insistence that said the baby had its own timeline and had no interest in the conversation happening in the room. And then, beneath the sound of the monitors and the machinery in Selim's controlled breathing and the weight of what had just been confirmed out loud for the first time in 9 months, the baby cried. One sound, clear and sharp and entirely new. Dr. Osei moved. The nurse moved. And the room compressed into the single pure chaos of arrival, of a new person entering a world that was not ready for them and did not need to be. 7 minutes later, Selim held his son for the first time. The baby was small and red and furious about existing and perfect in that specific way that made everything else in the room go blurry at the edges. Zoran stepped forward slowly and held out both hands. Not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. Selim looked at him for a long moment. Then he placed the baby carefully in Zoran's arms. The baby stopped crying. Just like that. 1 second, wailing. The next, silence. Small face turned inward. Tiny fist uncurled. Zoran stood there holding his son and did not move and did not speak, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing Selim had ever seen on another human being. That matters. Pause on that. Because a man who rules an empire, a man whose name makes other men step back, was standing in a hospital room with a newborn in his arms and nothing in his expression except something that looked like wonder. Zale held the baby for 4 minutes. He didn't say anything. He stood near the window, the baby against his chest, and stared down at the small face with the focused intensity he usually reserved for things that required solutions. But this wasn't a problem. His jaw was loose. His shoulders were down. Every defensive line his body knew how to hold had released. Then Zev took the baby. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. He held the baby the way someone holds something they are afraid of damaging, careful and present and fully committed to the weight of it. The baby's small fingers found the edge of Zev's thumb and closed around it. Zev didn't look up for a while. When he did, his eyes were dark and quiet and direct, and he looked at Selim like a man arriving somewhere after a very long time away. Selim was watching all 3 of them. He was exhausted in the way that runs all the way down to the bone, the kind that sleep doesn't fully reach. But he was watching. He was always watching. It was how he had survived this long. He watched the baby respond to each of them. Not the same way with strangers. Not the stiff, searching alertness of a newborn encountering an unfamiliar presence. This was something else. Something that looked like recognition. The baby settled against each of them in turn with the comfort of a creature that had been waiting to meet something it already knew was coming. Omega Alpha biology. The bond didn't require introductions. Zoran was the one who finally broke the quiet. He had moved to the side of the bed. Not at the foot. Not at a distance. He crouched down so that he was below Selim's eye level. A deliberate choice, a man making himself smaller on purpose. And when he spoke, his voice was low enough that it didn't reach the hallway. Why didn't you tell us? The question landed clean. No accusation in it. No performance of hurt. Just a man asking a real question and waiting for a real answer. Selim looked at him for a moment. He had run this conversation in his head before. Different versions. Different rooms. Different versions of himself who were braver or angrier or more broken than the version sitting here right now. He had drafted the sharp answer. The cold answer. The answer that kept the wall up. But he was tired. And the wall had cost him something. Because powerful men like you don't stay, Selim said. Flat. Honest. No apology behind it. Zoran didn't flinch. Who told you that? No one had to. A beat of silence. You looked us up, Zoran said. Not accusatory. Just following the logic. Voron Holdings. 3 investigative pieces. A criminal enterprise that spans 4 countries. Selim held his gaze. What was I supposed to think? That we might surprise you. Men with that kind of power don't usually bother. Zoran was quiet for a moment. Then, you're right that most don't. He looked at the baby in Zev's arms. Looked back at Selim. We're not most. Selim didn't answer right away. Because he wanted to believe it. That was the problem. He had wanted to believe it from the first hour in the clinic hallway. And that wanting was exactly the thing he'd spent 9 months being careful about. Wanting something from men like this was how people got broken. He had a child now. He could not afford to get broken. Zale came away from the window. He moved to the other side of the bed and stood with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set and his eyes on the middle distance the way he did when he was working through something he didn't have clean language for yet. We left because you were in danger, he said. That's not an excuse. That's what happened. There are people who watch our movements specifically for soft targets. People we interact with, people who could be used against us. We made a call that morning. We thought it was the right one. He looked at Selim then. Direct. We were wrong about what it would cost you. The baby made a small sound. Not a cry. Just a sound. Like punctuation. Zev looked down at the small face and said, He knows we're here. He's been around your scent since before he was born, Selim said. Quiet. Not soft, just true. He recognized you the second you walked into that room. Zale turned his head. Before we walked in? The hallway. I could smell you in the hallway. A pause. Same way I could in the clinic. Something moved between the 3 brothers without words. The current that ran between them when they were all processing the same thing. Zoran leaned forward. Selim. He waited until Selim looked at him. We are not going to walk out that door and leave you in this alone. That ends tonight. A breath. That's not a negotiation. That's not a condition. That's just what's true. Selim looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his son. At the small sleeping face pressed against Zev's chest. At the 4 fingers still wrapped around Zev's thumb. At the peaceful absolute trust of a creature who hadn't learned yet to be afraid of what the world did to people who trusted. He thought about every night in that apartment. Every double shift. Every hour he'd spent calculating how much protection he could build out of willpower and stubbornness and sheer refusal to ask for what he needed. He thought about the word alone again, and how heavy it had gotten. He looked back at Zoran. Don't make promises here that you can't keep outside this room. Zoran held his gaze without blinking. Then come outside the room, he said, and we'll show you. The security alert came at 4:17 a.m. Zale saw it first. His phone lit up on the windowsill where he'd set it. face down, silent, the way he always left it in rooms that needed quiet. He looked at the screen, looked at his brothers, said nothing out loud. He didn't need to. Zoran was already moving toward him. The message was 3 lines. Their head of security, a man named Theron Briggs, who did not send alerts at 4 a.m. for anything below a specific threshold, had flagged movement. 2 vehicles, unregistered, running dark plates, stopped half a block from the hospital's east entrance. Signal jammers in the area had gone up in the last 20 minutes, which meant phones in a 2-block radius were running slow or dropping calls. This was not coincidence. Someone knew. Zoran read the screen. His face stayed completely still, which was the version of his face that meant he was doing the kind of thinking that other men's panic interfered with. Selim was awake. He had been watching them from the bed since Zale's phone lit up, tracking the shift in the room the way he tracked everything, quietly and without drama. The baby was in the hospital bassinet now, sleeping on his back, small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that made the monitor numbers run green and steady. "Something's wrong," Selim said. "Not a question." "Something is being handled," Zoran said. "Those are different things. This one happens to be both." Selim looked at the 3 of them, at the way Zale had moved to the door, at the way Zev had shifted, imperceptibly to most people, visible to anyone paying attention, to a position that put him between the bassinet and the room's only window. "They know about the baby," Selim said. Silence. That was the answer. He felt it move through him. Not panic, not collapse, but something colder and more focused. The part of him that had kept a packed bag since week 32. The part that had always been ready because ready was the only option available when you did things alone. "How long have they known?" "We don't know yet," Zale said from the door. "Possibly since tonight. Possibly longer. The hospital admission. It's the most likely point." Selim nodded once. He looked at his son sleeping in the bassinet. He thought about the drive here. About Terrell asking, "You good?" About every single choice he'd made over the last 9 months that had been designed to keep this life safe, and about how safety, it turned out, was not something that could be built entirely by one person in an apartment with a locked door and a budget and a stubborn refusal to need help. "What do you need to do?" he asked. Zoran turned to look at him. Something in his expression shifted. "Theron is already at the east entrance with 4 of our people." He paused. "We need to move you." "When?" "Now." Selim looked at the baby. "He's 6 hours old." "I know. A beat." "He's also the heir to everything we have," Zoran said quietly. "And there are people in the parking lot right now who know that. They learned something tonight that changes the math for them." He looked at Selim directly. "Which means the math changes for us too." Zale had his phone to his ear. Low, rapid conversation with someone on the other end. Zev crossed the room, not fast, not rushed, and picked up the baby from the bassinet with the same careful, deliberate grip he'd used an hour ago. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Zev looked at Selim. "We have him," he said. "Simple." "Sure." Selim stood up. His body registered the objection. 9 months of carrying and 6 hours since labor and every muscle below his waist filing a formal complaint. But he stood up and stood straight because this was not the moment to be anything other than present and on his feet. He looked at Zale by the door. "How many people do you have outside?" "Enough." "That's not a number." 8 on site, 6 more on approach. Theron runs 12-person teams. A pause. "It's enough." Selim nodded. Dr. Osei appeared in the doorway behind Zale, having been notified by the nursing staff that something was in motion. She looked at the room. At Selim standing, at Zev holding the baby, at the alert on Zale's phone, and made the kind of rapid clinical assessment that good doctors make when circumstances go outside the protocol they trained for. She looked at Selim. "You're not ready to be discharged." "I know. Medically, I'm advising." "I hear you," Selim said, "and I'll follow everything you give me. But I need you to tell me what I need to take with me, because I'm leaving this room." He paused. "Someone made a decision for me tonight without asking." I'm making this one myself. Dr. Osei looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to the supply cabinet and started pulling things out. She worked fast. She handed him a discharge packet, a prescription list, a card with her direct number, and a look that said she was not happy about this, and was also not going to waste time arguing with a man who had already decided. 48 hours, she said. I want you in my clinic. Both of you. Done, Selim said. He looked at Zoran. Zoran was already on his phone. One sentence. No context. Low and certain. Then they'll learn something tonight. He ended the call. He looked at his brothers. He looked at Selim. And for the first time since he walked into that room and found the thing he hadn't known he'd been looking for, he looked like a man who had decided exactly what came next and was not going to be moved from it. The estate was quiet when they arrived. Not the brittle quiet of emptiness. The settled quiet of a large space at rest, of high ceilings and warm light and the specific hush that comes when a building has been prepared for something to finally happen inside it. Selim stood in the front entry with the baby against his chest, wrapped in the hospital blanket because no one had thought to bring something else, and he looked at the space around him. It was not what he'd expected. He had expected cold. Marble. The kind of interior that announces wealth by making you feel small inside it. There were expensive things here, the architecture alone said that, but the rooms he moved through had texture. Books that had been read. A chair near a window with a worn armrest. A kitchen that smelled of actual cooking from earlier in the day. It felt like somewhere people lived, not just existed. Zoran showed him to a room on the second floor that had been prepared quickly but carefully. A bed turned down, the temperature adjusted, a bassinet near the window that Selim had not been consulted on but which was the right height and the right model and had clearly not been pulled from a storage room. Someone had thought about this. Before tonight. He looked at the bassinet and then at Zoran. Zoran said nothing for a moment. Then, we've been thinking about you since March. Selim set the baby down slowly, adjusted the blanket, watched the small face settle back into sleep. You could have found me, Selim said. Yes. Why didn't you? Zoran leaned against the doorframe. He looked tired in the way people look when they've been moving on adrenaline for hours and the adrenaline is finally stepping back. Because finding you meant bringing you into this. He gestured broadly, at the estate, at the life it represented, at everything it came attached to. And you hadn't asked for this. You hadn't signed up for what it means to be close to us. We thought staying away was protecting you. You were wrong. Yes. No hesitation. We were wrong. Selim looked at him for a moment. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and let himself be tired. Let the weight of the last 9 months settle into his shoulders without fighting it for the first time since this started. The room was warm. The baby was breathing. The 3 men who had walked out of a rainy night and into his life and left something permanent behind were now standing in a house that could hold all of it. The danger and the damage and the possibility and whatever came next. In the days that followed, the estate adjusted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. In the small ways that spaces change when they're asked to hold something new. Zale, who moved through the world like every room was a board meeting, started coming down to the kitchen at 6 a.m. because that was when the baby was most awake and he had decided, without announcing it, that he was going to be there for that hour. He held the baby with the same focused attention he gave everything. He talked to him low, specific, like briefing someone about nothing in particular. The weather, the news, the names of the rooms in the house. The baby watched his face with the absolute concentration of someone receiving important information. Zoran cooked badly but persistently. He looked up recipes on his phone and executed them with the same determination he brought to complicated negotiations, which meant the results were technically accurate but occasionally aggressive. The eggs were always slightly overdone. The soup was always slightly too much of everything. But the kitchen smelled good and he was there every morning, in the same worn gray shirt, trying. Selim ate every meal. He told himself it was just practical. Postpartum recovery required nutrition. That was a medical fact. It had nothing to do with the way the kitchen felt different when someone else was in it. Zev was quiet the way he'd always been, but his quietness had a different quality now. It filled rooms rather than emptying them. He would sit near wherever the baby was. Bassinet, blanket on the floor, Selim's lap. Not demanding anything, not narrating anything, just present. A steady thing. The baby reached for him first. Not a grasp, newborns don't really grasp yet, not with intent. But a lean. A turn of the small body toward the source of warmth and scent and frequency that it had been calibrated to since before it was born. Toward Zev, with a trust so complete it had no room for doubt. Selim watched this from the armchair by the window on a Tuesday afternoon in early December. The light coming in low and gold, the estate quiet in the way it had gotten quiet in the week since they arrived. Not the quiet of absence but of people learning how to be somewhere together. He watched Zev hold his son. He watched Zoran come in from the hallway with a mug of something and set it near Selim's elbow without being asked and then go back to whatever he'd been doing. No ceremony, no expectation. He watched Zale on the floor with the baby's toes in one hand and a contract document in the other, reading the contract and talking to the baby simultaneously with zero apparent sense that this was unusual. He thought about the clinic, about the rain, about 3 strangers who came in out of the dark and turned out to be the kind of broken that looked exactly like strength from the outside. He thought about the question he'd asked himself 100 times in 9 months, lying in that apartment at 3 a.m. when the loneliness sat on his chest like a stone. What kind of men were they, really? He had his answer now. Not from what they said. Not from the estate or the resources or the security team outside. From this. From a man learning to cook eggs. From a quiet person choosing the chair nearest the baby every single time. From someone who bought the right bassinet before he'd been asked. He thought about what he'd read in those articles. Empire. Fear. Power. And he thought about what power looked like right now in this room. Zale had fallen asleep on the floor with the baby on his chest. The document was still in his hand. The baby's face was turned toward his neck. Both of them breathing slow. Zoran came back to the doorway. Saw them. Stopped. His face did the thing it did. The complicated thing that finished somewhere in his expression that looked, this time, unmistakably like peace. He looked at Selim. Selim looked back. Nothing was fixed. The world outside that estate had not changed overnight. The danger had not gone away and the complications had not resolved, and there were 100 conversations ahead of them that would be hard and require honesty that none of them had fully practiced yet. But this room existed. This room was real. And Selim, who had spent 9 months holding everything alone because he'd been certain it was the only option, let himself feel what it was like to put some of it down. Not because the world had become safe, because he was no longer in it alone. Sometimes the strongest men in the world aren't the ones who rule empires. Sometimes they're the ones who learn how to hold something fragile without breaking it. And sometimes it takes a rainy night, a dying dog, and 9 months of silence to find out that the people you thought would leave were always the ones who were going to stay. If the story moved you, if you've ever had to carry something alone that was never meant to be carried that way, drop a comment below. Your words matter here, and if you want more stories about love, survival, and people choosing each other when it costs them something real, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is built to stay with you. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.